I like it better than Hinduism as a philosophy, but it doesn't really work for me, so I do this other thing over here because it actually works for me. It brings me more joy. That's what we're really saying. We're saying it just doesn't work for me. If it works for you, right, it changes your life. It changes your life. And so I think that's like the danger of hypocrisy. So for those of you who aren't believers, let me just say you have a right, I'm just going to give you permission right now, to call Christians on their stuff, right? So if a Christian said, if someone says they're a follower of Jesus and they're not living like it, you have my permission to walk right up to them and say, I didn't think that was okay with your whole Jesus, following Jesus bit. Isn't Jesus like forgiving us then? Did Jesus say it was okay to judge people? Like, I think you have a right to just walk up to people and say that, right? If they claim to follow Jesus, doesn't that give you a right to hold them to their own standards? I think you have a right to hold people to their own standards, just not other people's. This is the problem I have with Christians, right? Is that we don't hold each other to our standards, but we hold everybody else to it. And that's just backwards. Christianity is supposed to have a double standard. One for insiders and one for outsiders. If you're not an insider, you don't have to live according to my standard. Like, I don't expect you to live like me because why would you? Doesn't make any sense. So I expect people who are not followers of Jesus to act like people who are not followers of Jesus. But people who are followers of Jesus, you better live like it. And if you're in my spiritual community and I see you being inconsistent and not being the good news, I'm like all over you like white on rice. I follow Buddha, but then they're like stepping on bugs and kicking cats and hitting dogs in the head, and then they're like all attached to their PSP and to their Xbox and to the place where they sit in class. If they're all attached to everything, I would be like, hey dude, have you actually read the teachings of Siddhartha Buddha? Like, I don't know if you've read them. And if you have, you're not trying real hard. Like, I would say that, right, to a Buddha. And it wouldn't be like I'm against Buddha. It would be like, you suck at Buddhism. I mean, you have a right to tell people, you suck at Buddhism. You shouldn't be, like, killing all these bugs. And if you're claiming to follow Jesus and you're not forgiving and you're not kind and you're not compassionate, I think people have a right to say, you suck at being a Christian. I mean, either you haven't like read the New Testament or you're not trying real hard. I think it's okay to say that. Now the problem, of course, is it's always going to be a problem because our standards are too high. For those of us who follow Jesus, the standards are like way too high. And by the way, I think this is true for everybody in the room on some level. Whether you claim to follow Jesus or not, you probably have standards that are too high, right? I mean, I don't know of any of my friends who would tell me that they always live up to their own standards. And if you do, your standards are too low. Right? I mean, if you tell me, David, I always live up to my standards, then probably a good bit. Really, right? I mean, how low are your standards if you always keep them? Probably pretty low. So they're probably not worth having. So the reality is everybody has standards probably that are lower, that are higher than they can attain. Christians especially. Now, when I say that we have, I think, the highest standards of all, I don't mean that we're the strictest. Because I have a lot of freedom as a follower of Jesus. Like, I can eat anything I want. I can eat shellfish, I can eat pork all the live long day. I can eat food that's raw, with blood still in it. Like, I can eat whatever I want. I can eat whatever I want. Diet. I mean, I can even, if I want to, I don't have to, but if I want to, I can consume alcoholic beverages. I'm not supposed to get drunk because that violates, I can't love people well. And our big law is love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. And I can't do that well if I don't know what I'm doing. So, I can't. So, I mean, I'm not supposed to get drunk, but I can have alcohol, and sex is okay inside of boundaries, so I'm married, so I'm allowed. Some religious groups say, no sex, these things you can't eat, these things you can't drink. I don't have a lot, we don't have a lot of restrictions, honestly. But the ethical standards are really, really high. I teach Eastern and Western religions, and I've studied a lot of religions, and one of my favorite people is a guy named Confucius. And Confucius said a lot of really good stuff. And one of the best things that Confucius ever said, and it's people in academia call it the silver rule, was he said, don't do to anybody else stuff you don't want them doing to you. Which, by the way, is a pretty good rule to live by. Don't leave your shopping cart in the middle of a parking space if you don't like it when people leave it in front of their parking space when you're pulling up. Don't sneeze on, your cart and not wipe it up if you wouldn't want somebody to do that to you, right? I mean, it's like, wash your hands after you go to the bathroom. Because you don't want to shake people's hands if they haven't washed their hands after going to the... it's basic common sense, right? That's good stuff. But it's the silver rule because there's a better rule. Jesus had the golden rule, which as far as we know, he came up with, which is do to others what you would have them do to you. And you're like, well, what's the big difference? Well, here's the deal. You could be dead and keep the silver rules. Right? If you're not breathing anymore, you're definitely not doing to other people stuff you don't want them doing to you. You know, you're not sneezing, you're not failing to wash your hands, you're just dead. But you know what? To obey the golden rule, you have to get out of your comfort zone. You have to be unselfish. You have to go out of your way to forgive. You have to go out of your way to do things that are going to be uncomfortable and inconvenient and at times difficult. The golden rule is a really high standard. Jesus had this famous message called the Sermon on the Mount that you can look up. It's in Matthew 5, 6, and 7. 3 chapters. And the stuff he said is mind-blowing. He said stuff like this. He said, you know, you've heard that it's wrong to commit adultery. Well, I tell you that actually it's wrong if you just look at someone and have lust in your heart. Okay, so kind of all screwed there, right? And that's a hard standard, isn't it? To control your thought life. Jesus said, you've heard it said, don't kill. And I tell you, in God's eyes, it's wrong to hate in your heart. To be mad at someone and stay with them. I mean, that's a high standard. When Jesus got finished with the Sermon on the Mount, I'm sure everybody thought, we're going to hell. I mean, everybody sitting there thought that because his standards are so high. Jesus' standards are really, really high. So there's always going to be a little bit of hypocrisy, I'll be honest with you. Because we're supposed to live by standards that are really high. Jesus said, love your enemies. If someone hits you on one cheek, turn the other. Pray for people. Christians often suck at being like Jesus. But you know what? The people who see hypocrisy, who aren't Christians, and say, that's a hypocrite, the very fact that you can identify a hypocrite says something about you. That you're pretty pro-Jesus. You just don't know it yet. Because that's the way he feels. It's exactly how he feels. He's like, that's not what I said. And you just said the same thing. What you're really saying is, the standards I'm okay with, just the person that failed I'm not so much okay with. So let's just for a moment just throw away that whole thing about Christians are often hypocrites, because we all agree with that. I mean, I don't know anyone in this room that can really deny that Christians are often hypocrites way too long. Not always, but I know some people who follow Jesus and are truly loving people. And they've forgiven people of just heinous stuff. And they have shown compassion in a way that cost them dearly. And they have loved people that you and I would find unlovable. And they have sacrificed, in some cases, their lives. And so it's not always true. It doesn't have to be true. Some people actually follow Jesus really well. But the bottom line isn't who does and who doesn't. I mean, most of us in this room could figure out, if we wanted to follow Jesus, who not to ask for advice. The question is, how well does Jesus live up to his standards? That's the real question, isn't it? How good does Jesus do at keeping his standards? And the answer is, if the New Testament, any of those 4 books, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the 4 biographies of Jesus, or give us any idea, he did pretty good. When Jesus said, you know, love your enemies, when he was being nailed to the cross, he prayed for the people doing it. He said, Father, forgive them because they don't really understand what they're doing. But that's love. That's forgiveness. I don't know about you, but I think I would have had choice words for these people. But he didn't. Peter, by the way, who was one of the people that lived with Jesus 90 days for 3 years, 90 days for 3 years, here's what he said in one of his letters. He said, Jesus never said or did anything wrong. I don't know about you, but anyone who spent a weekend with me wouldn't say that. Right? One weekend with me, if I'm trying my best, they wouldn't say that. 3 years, night and day, Peter said, I lived with a guy for 3 years, and I can tell you this, he never said or did anything. I mean, Jesus really lived up to his standards. So the question isn't, how bad do people who claim to be followers of Jesus do at keeping it? The real question is, what are you going to do with Jesus, the guy saying this stuff? Because his standards are good. And he lived up to it. And I think this is a lot about who he is. So the real issue is, what are you going to do with these crummy Christians? Because I don't really care what you do with some of them, frankly. I'd like to beat up a few. The real issue is, what are you going to do with Jesus? What are you going to do with him? I think that's just a distraction, really, from the real thing, which is, so what if a whole bunch of people stink at following? A lot of people stink at following Buddha. What are you going to do with Jesus? I would not look at Buddhism because a few people squish bugs and claim to follow Buddha. I would say, you know what? I'm still going to read Siddhartha Buddha because I think he's better than them. And I think the same is true for Jesus. I think he's worth looking at. He's worth knowing. Because if you look at his life, the things he said and the things he did, it was the kind of stuff you'd expect God to say and do. And if there is a God, I think Jesus is. And I think he's worth looking at. He's worth getting to know, in spite of the fact that a whole lot of Christians are hypocrites.
Let's give it to the